PSAs. And now I would like it if you would help me welcome our guest speaker today. Dr. Spencer Crew is the Clarence J. Robinson Professor of History at George Mason University and Emeritus Director of the National Museum of African American History and the National Museum of American History. For museum people, that's like big. Okay. Previous to teaching at George Mason, he served as the president of the National Underground Railroad Freedom Center for 6 years, and he worked at the National Museum of American History, the Smithsonian Institution, for 20 years. 9 of those, he served as the director. He most recently served as the interim director of the National Museum of African American History and Culture. At each of these institutions, he sought to make history accessible to the public through innovative and inclusive exhibitions and public programs. A man after my own heart. Dr. Crew has published extensively in the areas of African American and public history, as well as curated numerous exhibitions, the most recent one at the National Museum of African American History and Culture, which we're going to go see next week. So please help me welcome Dr. Spencer Crew.
Good evening. Hello. A friendly group, good, so I can relax? Yeah. All right, good. I like that idea. I very much appreciate the offer to come and speak tonight, especially to talk about Freedman's Village. I knew a little bit about it before. I'd done some research, but really at the surface. So this opportunity gave me a chance to do a lot more digging and a chance to share with you additional things that I've learned. So I won't put myself out here as an expert on Freedman's Village, but I will put out here that I know enough to get in trouble. So hopefully we'll see how that goes. So this image you see here is of the Freedman's Village Bridge, which was dedicated, I think, in 2015, if my Google told me correctly. And it was done to connect Washington Boulevard over Columbia Pike, but also as a way of beginning to remember that village, remember the people who were part of it, and to make sure that history is not lost. And what we'll try to do tonight is to make sure that we continue to understand more about that history. Now, in the early stages of the Civil War, President Lincoln, who we see here, did not see the war as one to end slavery. In his view, it was a war to save the Union. And he was going to do everything he could to do that. If it meant leaving slavery in place, he was willing to do that as well. But what happened is that his plans sort of began to fall apart, in part because of the actions done by African Americans, enslaved African Americans, who decided to act. And actually that first act of rebellion or pushback took place right here in the state of Virginia at a place, slide disappeared, at a place called Fort Monroe, down near Hampton, Virginia. And at that location were Union troops. This is in the early 1860s. And as the Union troops were sitting there, 3 African-American men who had been enslaved came to the fort. And they talked to the general, General Benjamin Butler, and said to him, "We want you to allow us to come over and have our freedom." Well, the first response they got, not from him, but from others, was that, wait a minute, this is not a war to end slavery, it's a war to save the Union. Their response back to those individuals was, you may think so, but it is already, you just don't know it yet. And as a consequence, they then went to meet with General Butler, and he finally decided that he would not, in fact, return them to their enslaver who had come to the camp to say, these are my property, and I want them back. He decided to classify them as what is called contraband of war. And essentially what contraband of war means is that there are things that the enemy has control over that they use to prosecute the war. And the other side has the right to keep those things from allowing the other side to continue to fight the war. So he cannot send you back to the Confederacy, because if you go back, you'll help them with the war. So at that stage, you begin to have a new direction to the war in terms of looking at these enslaved people and what they stand for. And the result of this is that he allowed these individuals to come to Fort Monroe And to settle there, there becomes a rush of individuals who recognize now that Union lines are the way in which they could get their freedom. So the numbers begin to increase rapidly because what the Army is doing now is not only allowing them to have their freedom, but they put in place a policy of providing wages for people to work for the Union Army, food, clothing, and other things for the formerly enslaved who come to these camps. Thus, Fort Monroe in many ways became the staging ground for emancipation during the war, and a place that many of the African Americans referred to as Freedom's Fortress, a place you could get to and get your freedom if you wanted it. And it also set a precedent for African Americans migrating to locations near Union lines to gain their freedom. After Congress enacted the end of slavery in Washington, D.C., it also became a site and a place where people would begin to flow to in order to get their freedom. After the Battle of Bull Run, which took place here in Virginia, as you all well know, that was not too far from Washington, D.C., 400 enslaved people then came to the city after the battle itself. And they were just a small part of the influx of individuals who began to flow into Washington, D.C. as the place where they could get their freedom and escape enslavement as they'd done before. By 1863, there were a number of contraband camps that existed on both sides of the Potomac River. It's estimated that the camps provided refuge for almost 10,000 individuals who had formerly been enslaved, but were now self-liberating themselves in order to get their freedom in Washington, D.C. The challenge is that as more and more people came to these camps that were created, these sort of makeshift camps that were quickly set up, they became quickly overcrowded and also began to deteriorate because they really weren't set up to handle a large number of people. And this prompted Washington, D.C. military authorities to try to figure out what can we do next? What steps do we take to create a better situation and new camps for these contrabands? And what they wanted to do was to find something that they thought would be outside of the city. Where they began to look then is in Arlington, which is across the city. And on May 5th, 1863, what Lieutenant Colonel Ellis M. Green, let me show you his picture here. And Danforth M. Nicholas, who was with the American Missionary Society, officially decided to select Arlington as the location for this Freedmen's Bureau. As you all well know, Arlington, where they selected it, was on the plantation formerly owned by Robert E. Lee and his wife, Mary Custis Lee, that had been in the Lee family for a long time. They loved the irony of this, that you were going to create a place for contraband for newly freed individuals on a plantation that had enslaved these individuals and others for a long, long time. It was located on the Virginia side of the rivers, overlooking Washington, D.C. Initially, 100 formerly enslaved people settled on the chosen site. The following December, Freedmen's Village was officially dedicated with a ceremony attended to by members of Congress and other notable officials. So this is December of 1863 is when it gets started. The design and layout of this new place was, in the eyes of the military and of the War Department, was to create a place that was orderly, that was sober, and industrious, and it'd be consistent with their view of how these individuals should direct their lives. And in 1865, the plan of settlement shows a very organized community of 17 acres, as you can see here. There are about 100 residents initially in this location, and the space itself had several different components to it. It had a hospital, it had a kitchen/mess hall, it had a schoolhouse, it had an old people's home. I don't like to call it old people's home. I like to call it mature people's home. A laundry, and amongst the many structures that were there. Each residence that existed, the homes in which people lived, was a story and 1/2 in height and was divided in half down the middle to be occupied by 2 families. So it was like a duplex that we talk about today. The streets and parks in this location all bore the name of generals or government officials. So it was a reinforcement of Washington, D.C. And there were a variety of shops there in which people learned different trades. Men learned carpentry and blacksmithing, among other things, and women were trained in the use of the needle, they say, sewing, but also in the use of the sewing machine. So they're also trying to give these newly freed individuals trade skills that they might be able to use otherwise. Some of the residents also got the opportunity to work for the federal government, and they had a chance to work as teamsters or fortification builders or in the hospital, in which they were paid for their work. I think hospital workers were paid 40 cents a day, which was about right for the wages during those periods. It's the same thing that whites were paid for the same work. The village became a semi-permanent settlement, and the government developed facilities and infrastructure to support several thousand people. So they're really beginning to understand that this is going to be a longer-term place, and that they had to put together facilities and ways of taking care of these individuals. They also set up rules and regulations for what you could do and what you couldn't do and how you would live your life. Adults who lived there, who did not have work outside of the village and other kind of places, worked on government farms that were located on the outside of the village. So they found work for individuals, even if they couldn't find work with the federal government. This was on acreage that was located just outside of Freedman's village in Arlington itself. In exchange for their work, these laborers were paid $10 per month. The problem, though, the challenge was that they got $10 a month, but half of it, $5, had to be given back for a general fund to maintain the village. So essentially, people were living on $5 a month. The government saw the village as not a permanent residence for people, but as a stepping stone, a place where you would come for a while, you would get settled, you get into a rhythm, and then you would leave to go somewhere else. The problem was that's not how it worked. Most people, once they got there, weren't interested in leaving. They really wanted to stay there. And once they got into a rhythm, once they found neighbors, once they sort of got used to where they were, didn't really want to move on to do something else. In fact, what happens is that the residents begin to create a very vibrant community, one in which there's lots going on, as you would expect any community when people are around each other together. There were fraternal organizations that were created, mutual aid societies, Masonic organizations, all of these different kind of organizations, sorority invitations, women's groups were put in place as a way of creating a community, a group of individuals that formed a large family that worked together. For the men, these organizations were a chance for them to begin to flex their political muscle. The 15th Amendment had been passed. Black men were allowed to vote. We still weren't allowing women to vote. But this was a chance for them to begin to think about politics, think about the kind of influence they can have in the local community and how they could use their vote to benefit them as an organization. The residents also created an active religious and educational environment in the village as well. By 1864, they had a permanent primary school and a permanent secondary school, which served more than 200 students. I've heard the number from 200 to 1,000. I can't quite verify it, but clearly it was a very active and a very well-used educational system. And it wasn't just an educational system for younger people. There was a great demand for education from the adults who had been enslaved, for whom getting an education, learning to read had been forbidden. In fact, you could be punished for learning how to read. So now that they had a chance to control their own lives, the chance to read and write and to be literate was an important part of them. So this was a growing aspect of the life there as well. And as a consequence, the literacy rate among those individuals who were living in this village rose dramatically. And I think it rose from about 10 to 15% to about 80% later on in the life of the village. So it really was quite an exciting environment for those individuals, and a place where they were having a chance to get exposure to and access to many things that had been denied them when they were enslaved. So you can imagine they weren't eager to leave. This was a life that they had dreamed about, a life that they considered to be a step in the right direction, and they didn't want to step away from that very easily. And physical layout, oops, there we go. The architecture of the place was designed to create an atmosphere of order, of sobriety, and of industry. They wanted this to be, when I look at this sometimes, you think about it, it's like the industrial towns that were created around the factories. The idea is you create this very orderly place where people could live, but they had to sort of live in a certain kind of way. And that was what's going on there. But at the same time, the federal government and federal officials really saw this as an important step forward. It was an illustration of what was possible for the newly free once they gained their freedom. As a consequence, you had a number of celebrations and events to take place there, where government officials from Washington, D.C. and from other places would come to Freedmen's Village and be a part of festivities there and celebrations and lectures to really highlight what they thought was a really important, innovative way of beginning to find a place and create a place for these newly freed individuals. But even with this notoriety, I think of the very positive vision that officials had about this place, there were disputes between the inhabitants of Freedmen's Village and government officials. This happened not only there, but happened in a lot of the contraband camps that were created across the country, because there is a different point of view between government officials and the newly freed about what is the best path to follow, what is the best way for them to proceed going forward. Camp officials use their control over the organization to teach, and I put that in quotes, the freed people habits of being industrious and hardworking. On one hand, what administrators would do in order to teach these lessons is they would withhold food and clothing and blankets from those who were not gainfully employed. So they expected you to work and they wanted you to work, and if you didn't work, you would be punished. On the other hand, they also imposed and charged rents for housing to make clear that shirkers would be replaced or evicted if they didn't work and have money to pay the rent. And they would forcibly evict people if they didn't have their rent paid. These issues, I believe, brought into contrast the differing views between the newly freed who are living in the village and Yankee officials who have this idea of New England hard work and Yankee industriousness. I think village residents did not have a fundamental argument or quarrel with efforts made to help them become self-supporting. They wanted to be self-supported. They wanted to control their own lives. But they did question how the federal employees were trying to make this happen, what kind of tactics they were employing to make it go forward. They felt that they had a right to claim for temporary assistance in the midst of what they considered to be extraordinary circumstances. What they were saying is that, look, we have been enslaved for years, decades, and longer. And we've just recently been able to gain our freedom. So given this, we need some help and some space in order to begin to adjust to this new life and to be able to figure out what should come next. And they felt that the officials were pushing too fast and too hard and too harshly to try to force them to take on the roles that they had in mind. And in fact, you begin to have a lot of arguments back and forth, and I think clashes between them. They felt that since they've been displaced, they deserve some support and some leeway going forward. And you could see lots of arguments taking place. In fact, a really interesting illustration of this is an altercation that took place in January of 1864. And it was between the mother of an African-American soldier and the camp superintendent. And they got into this back and forth. And finally, in order to justify what she felt was the need for them to give her space and to allow her to be treated better, she says to have the right to support from the government. She says, I gave up my child upon the word and honor of the government to go and tote his musket, and he has gone and lost his life. I think, sir, that is enough for me to get special dispensation. And I think this is what they are feeling, is that their family members are going off to fight the war. They've been enslaved for long periods of time. And this deserves some consideration. This deserves some understanding about what they're going through and what they should expect. Furthermore, I think the freedmen view the imposition of rents and obstruction to their efforts to support themselves. If you're getting paid $10 a month, they're taking $5 away. They're not really creating a space for you to have economic independence. In their eyes, in the eyes of the official, the idea of a rent of $5 or maybe a bit less sometimes was not that big a deal. It's only $5. But when you think about $5 being half of what the money that you make every month, it plays out in a different kind of way. And so in the eyes of the residents, this rent payment was considered to be burdensome. Especially they felt on top of the $5 monthly contraband fee. So keep in mind, they took $5 away for the care of the village. Then on top of that, they were charging people who have homes $1 or $3 per month rent for their place. So if you add it all together, that's $8 a month you had to have available to stay in the village. And if you were making $10 a month payment, that leaves very little for you to live on. And in the eyes of the residents, this is burdensome. This is unfair and something that shouldn't be happening. And they resented how the superintendent sort of manipulated this to force people out and make them leave when they didn't really want to leave. For example, families of military laborers and soldiers in the field routinely had the problem that the government would slow in paying. Have you ever had that experience? Slow pay from the government? Same thing was happening, is that they would be working for the government as laborers, and the government would be very slow about paying them. But on the other hand, village officials wanted their payment promptly. First of the month, they wanted it right away, and they were beginning to harass them about that issue. And so this became a real area of tension between the two groups. And for the remainder of the war, this is the policy put forward by federal officials. And these are the issues that residents of the village had to work with. And as a consequence, they began to look for work wherever they could and to help supplement their income, but also have the money to pay this rent and to pay this $5 fee that was charged everywhere. Able-bodied men found employment as military laborers and some in nearby farm fields. So they would go out beyond the village and begin to look for work to take care of their families. Women sewed. They worked in the fields and gardens with men. And also they worked for men who are unable to really work heavy jobs. They were also put to work in the farms and gardens. So there was lots of different things available, but people felt pushed into these things and not having much choice in terms of their options to make sure they could earn the money they needed to be able to stay in the village itself. And the population, though, kept growing during this time period. It's estimated that in Alexandria itself, between 1860 and 1866, the population quadrupled in size. It went from 2,800 to more than 8,000 individuals. And the District of Columbia had more than doubled from 14,000 individuals to 28,000 individuals. So you have this attraction of these camps of the village that people are coming to. You have this tension going on, but it's continuing to grow. And I think the officials are trying to figure out, how do we handle all this? With the end of the war, finally, in the 1865, Freedmen's Village and other camps that were around the country, the officials there began to encourage and think about, how can we get these residents to leave? The war is over. We don't want to be in this business any longer. How do we encourage these individuals to leave? One push they had was to encourage them to leave the villages and to leave these camps and to go west and south. That the war over, there was a demand for workers in these different parts of the country. The Mississippi Valley was the place in which they were really looking for workers. But the problem is that these landowners who were in these areas didn't want to act like the war was over. They didn't want to act like slavery had ended. For them, the idea is they wanted these individuals to come back to Mississippi, Georgia, Alabama, Texas, and to re-enter and act the way they had when they were enslaved. They wanted to control their lives. A good example of this is that there were people who were plantation owners who got angry at these families when the husband and wife decided the wife no longer was going to work in the field. That she was a wife and a mother, and her task was to take care of the family, not to work in the field. This angered some of these plantation owners because they were used to having the women work in the field as well. So you have this different view about what post-enslavement was supposed to be like. And this did not sit well with those who were being asked to go to these places. Also, there's the issue that, in fact, the unhappiness that was happening in these places from the landowners might result in violence directed towards them. The rise of the Ku Klux Klan and other kind of groups was, in fact, the idea to get these formerly enslaved individuals to act the way they thought was appropriate. So it wasn't really enticing to want to go there and to live. As a result, residents of Freedmen's Village were not eager to leave, as you can imagine. Many hoped that the Freedmen's Bureau, who took over control of this, first it was the War Department, then when the Freedmen's Bureau was created, it took over control of Freedmen's Village. They hoped that the Bureau would provide work for people who lived in the village. And what they did was, therefore, to repeatedly reject offers that were made by farmers out west in the South for wages of $8 to $10 a month, because what they recognized was that there was a drawback to making that decision. They knew that if they returned to these rural areas, they would not be treated equally. They would not be treated fairly. And that instead, what they wanted was the chance to have control over their own labor and to make it also have control over the labor and the activities and the choices their families could make. They also wanted protection from abuse. They did not want to face violence. They did not want to face lynching and things like that. Without these guarantees, they were not willing to leave. And you can't imagine, you can't really blame them for wanting to stay where they are and not go into these areas where they could find themselves in great trouble. In addition, after the war, community life within the village began to grow. Fraternal and mutual aid societies matured and became centers for political discussions and activities and political involvement. Also, you have religious institutions coming into existence. In 1866, Little Zion Methodist Church was created, and Old Bell Baptist Church was formed as well. So you have this church life developing during the time period as well. The Reverend Robert F. Laws, who also worked as an employment agent and as a teacher in the village, was the pastor of Old Bell Baptist Church. And what happens is that as the population grows and more people are coming into this area, Old Bell Church benefits from this. And in less than 10 years, it expanded and divided into what is probably now some of you know is Mount Olive Baptist Church and Mount Zion Baptist Church. It had its beginnings in the village. For me, it resonates. The church I go to, I usher. And ushers go out to other churches periodically and do things. So Mount Olive is one of the ones we go to a lot. So for me, it was a history lesson I didn't have before, but it gives you a sense of the longevity of these places and how important the village was to their creation and to their development. During 1866, with the end of the war, Bureau officials decided there was time to force everybody to work. And they want anyone who had any kind of capability to start working to be industrious and to sort of lead the kind of life that they wanted. Ironically, what they're doing is while they're forcing people to work, in part to have them have money to pay for the rent, pay for the village. At the same time, they began to cut back on their workforce. That they were having high administrative costs, and they decided they were going to cut back on the jobs available to people. They also began to force people who've been paid before to now work as an unpaid worker. Something we recognize today in today's world as well is that they cut back the force and they expect the people there to do more work for the same amount of time or for less. They also ordered all unemployed inhabitants to leave. If you didn't have a job, you were supposed to go. So they really were tightening down and really trying to squeeze the members of the village. They further required persons who had built dwellings outside the village proper to tear them down. So if you didn't have a house on the grounds, the 17 acres of the village proper, and had built a house outside those grounds, it said you had to tear it down. These, I think, things, and people who failed to comply with these rules and regulations were evicted or thrown away and sent away. So it became a very difficult and trying time. I think these last edicts did not sit well with the residents of the village, as you can imagine. I mean, it feels like they're under attack. And so what they began to do is to organize and generate a protest against the camp's administration. The effort is led by the Reverend Robert S. Laws of Mount Zion Baptist Church. Some described him as the leader of the public sentiment in the village. And he would organize protest activities, petitions, and other things that put them in direct opposition with the superintendent of the village and trying to find ways to either get him to change his ways or they hope maybe to get him fired and someone better there. As I said, he organizes a series of public meetings to protest what they see as the harsh conditions in the village itself. Among the things they were protesting were the fact that the bureaus was very stingy in terms of how it took care of the destitute. That they had a house for the poor, but they were very harsh and very unfeeling in the way that they treated them. Also, they were angry about the small size of rations that were given to people who worked for the government, who got paid with some money, but also with the rations that were given to them. And they also protested the ejection of unemployed people who are unable to pay rent. So they thought this was unfair and harsh because some of these people, they said, were actually employed but hadn't been paid yet. And some were disabled veterans who had fought in the war, who had come back disabled, and they felt should get special dispensation, or at least leeway in terms of how they were treated. This, for the residents and for Reverend Laws and others, was not the way it should be. And to make matters worse, as these new laws came into place, it was during the time of one of the coldest winters ever in Washington, D.C. So it's getting colder, more harsh, and people being thrown out of their houses. So all these things are working against them. And I think this begins to outrage and anger the members of the village itself. And what happens, though, is that they put together a petition that they send to the Freedmen's Bureau and to the person who's in charge of the Freedmen's Bureau for the District of Columbia. And they ask him to look into these issues, and they ask him to begin to recognize that the superintendent is not caring for the members of the village in the ways that he should. He's not being compassionate. He's not really paying attention to the realities, and is just acting on a sort of a rote way of acting that doesn't take human lives, human condition into account. That they said was that the question was whether or not the superintendent was following orders, as he's directed to do by the Freedmen's Bureau, which included being compassionate, at least understanding the individuals, but instead he was just forcing people out with a lack of understanding and a lack of compassion. They also argued that the $5 monthly tax, contraband tax, with that, if everybody has to pay $5 into a pool to take care of the village, they said that should cover rent. Why should you have to pay $5 and then pay rent as well? So they're asking for a really different way of operating. And the last thing they asked for, which didn't seem unreasonable, was that rather than having the superintendent be in charge of collecting rent and deciding how rent should be done, let us do it. Let us find ways to take care of this issue of the rent. We're good Christians. We are compassionate Christians, and let us use our compassion and our awareness of the needs of our neighbors to be the ones to collect the rent, to keep the village afloat, but to do it in a way that doesn't unfairly treat members of the residents of the village. Well, the good news is that, in fact, the Freedmen's Bureau does look into these issues, and they do begin to take steps to try to improve conditions. First thing they do is they get rid of the superintendent. And you can imagine that the residents, Reverend Law, were very happy. But they do refuse to have it rent-free. They still want to have rent paid. They don't let the residents decide on it, but they're trying to find ways to do it in a much more compassionate way. The bad news is that for his efforts, Reverend Laws was fired and kicked out of the camp. So while he was the leader and I think the inspiration and had made things happen, the result was that he found himself excluded from life in the village. Also, any sense of victory that the residents might have felt from this was very much short-lived, because the following year, after this change, after the reorganization, you begin to have new things put in place to basically dismantle Freedmen's Village. So here's how the work begins to go to get rid of the village. The first plan they had was to put up for general sale all the buildings at Freedmen's Building and let speculators and others come in and buy the buildings. Now the residents again organized, even without Reverend Laws directly involved, and they were able to delay this initial order to have these buildings sold. What they asked for was time for them to make arrangements to maybe come with the money and the resources to buy some of these buildings themselves. But however, after a few months delay, the government was back at it. They decided to put in place a two-part plan regarding Freedmen's Village. The first thing they did was to move inhabitants of the hospital, the grounds of Freedmen's Village, to the hospital, Freedmen's Hospital at Howard University. Are you all familiar with it? Yeah. My mother trained there as a nurse. It was really, looking at these connections is really very interesting. So they sent all those residents to Howard University to be part of Freedmen's Hospital. Secondly, what they did was they did permit the residents to begin to purchase their dwellings and to rent some of the others that were there, so that eventually quite a few individuals were able to purchase buildings and to begin to create home or purchase land and begin to build on this land. And what the villagers did was to use their institutions to organize and lobby for their rights. And this was a counterbalance to the ideas of the government. The residents faced with the aid from the government began to pool money and find ways that they could buy land and to buy homes for themselves. And they also established a system of what they call rent to own activities, so that you could rent and part of the rent would go towards owning that property. So they're trying to find creative ways in which they can begin to get ownership and control this land that had been their home for such a long time. In subsequent years, villagers were able to maintain homes in and around the village. The homes were described as neat, tidy, and very comfortable. Many residents improved upon these homes through creating additions, land beautification, and some spent as much as 2 or 3 times what they originally paid for it in order to improve the house itself. The villagers also paid land rents as well, in terms of land taxes as well, in terms of local taxes, state taxes, the federal poll tax, road taxes, school taxes, and personal property taxes. So they are paying lots of different taxes, but are being productive, contributing residents of the area. Sadly, in 1872, 6 years after the first attempt to close the village, the Freedmen's Bureau, which had been sponsoring Freedmen's Village and sort of been the spokesman for them, was closed. And this did not augur well for Freedmen's Village, because without a federal government body to lobby for them, other agencies began to look at this thing with very greedy eyes and trying to decide how they can get access to this land. And what happens is that, first of all, you have the War Department, who wants to find a way to first expand Arlington Cemetery, which is right there, and also to expand Fort Myers, which is there as well. So they're looking at how do we get more land that we can control and do the things we want to do. Others in the federal government wanted the land to create a new roadway network from Georgetown to Mount Vernon, George Washington. So they're looking for land to do that. And in 1889, the Department of Agriculture joined in by calling for the need for 400 acres of land to create an experimental farm. So you begin to have these federal agencies looking with covetous eyes on this area that is the Freedmen's Village, which is never good. It's never good. In addition, white residents of Arlington also wanted to curb back Black political power in the area. And they wanted to do that by closing the village, because the village is well organized. The village politically is operating in ways that allows them to have influence and impact on the surrounding areas. What they felt is, they said, what they claimed was that, in quotes, the presence of Negroes on the reservation, that's Freedmen's Village, has a peculiar effect on politics, that African Americans were controlling the county elections concerning the Board of Supervisors. So they were, people in Freedmen's Village were using their voting power to have an impact upon who's elected as a county supervisor and what kind of policies were put in place. It's a reminder that while we pay a lot of attention to national politics, local politics are really important. Local politics impact your life probably even more so than national politics. And that's what's going on here in terms of how people were feeling about what was happening around them. What in fact was the issue was that they actually resented African Americans holding elected office. They felt they did not deserve it, and they felt they were having a negative impact upon politics in that area. To fight back, what villagers did was to send representatives to the War Department to lobby against these activities. The person they sent there to do that was John B. Syphax of the Syphax family. Syphax family is well known in this area. He acted as a representative for the community, and he argued that not only had the residents paid the rents and constructed houses, but they were actually active taxpayers in that area. And as a result, he argued they had a valid claim to remaining there to the land and not to have it taken away from them by the federal government. If nothing else, as he saw that argument falling upon deaf ears, what Syphax said was that if in fact you have to do this, we don't want you to do it, we'd rather you didn't do it, that at least you must compensate people for their land that you're going to take away, eminent domain. And he said, at least you should pay each individual who owns property or has a home there $350 in order to compensate them for their loss. It's a lot more in today's money, but it was a lot then, but not nearly probably the value of what they had there. To silence these protests, what the government decides to do is they put together a group to do a survey of the land and of the property to think about what they want to do. But in the end, they decided not to do much of anything. To end the protest, what they did do was they give their residents some money for their land, but not nearly the 350 and not nearly what the value was. And as a consequence, we're buying this land far below market value. By 1900, the last Freedmen's Village residents had been bought out and relocated and no longer lived on that land. They lived in nearby land. They lived in Arlington County, but they did not live in on that land of the village, which meant that nearly 40 years after the community's formation, Freedmen's Village ceased to exist. So this happens in 1900, is that the village ceases to exist. What this does then is to bring to a conclusion the history and the story of Freedmen's Village. That story ends, but there's another story about the life of African Americans in this area. That's another story that needs to be discussed. And part of it, you have to understand, has to do with they're finding new places to live and being dispossessed again. That the creation of the Pentagon has a huge impact upon that community, and Boston has a big impact upon that community as well. So that's the story for a different time, far beyond what I know at this point. But what I tried to give you is an overview of the life and evolution and the final demise of Freedmen's Village. It's an important story and an important legacy that we should all keep in mind. And I think value in terms of what we can learn about how those who are newly freed created a life for themselves here in Arlington County. So thank you very much. Oh, absolutely.
Thank you so much. I will tell you that I have a lot of questions from the 100 and people that are online. So I don't know if you want to start in the audience and that, but that was so informative. We're just curiously taking questions here online. So, Annette, let me know.
Okay, I'm gonna, they can't hear him speak, so they're not gonna repeat it.
Yeah, excellent talk. I was wondering if you came across John M. Langston in your study, because he was for whom our highway is named now in Arlington. He was the Inspector General at the Freedmen's Bureau for a while. I'm wondering if you had any direct connection with him in Freedmen's Village.
I did not run across that. And again, as I said,
Can you repeat that question for the people? Yeah.
Question was whether I'd come across John Langston. Langston, who is his role was.
He was Inspector General of the Freedmen's Bureau, but we have a highway name for him now at Arlington.
He's Inspector General of the Freedmen's Bureau. We have a highway here laid back. And my short answer was I had not, unfortunately.
Another one from the audience? You certain that?
I was wondering, are there records on individual records of residents?
The questions of individual records of residents, not that I'm aware of. You might be able to find some things in the census. And if you can trace your family back, then you might find things in previous bureau holdings. But in terms of the individuals in great depth, I'm not aware of it. But again, I think there's things to be explored and to be found, including SciFax and others we know about. And I actually tried to find this information about Reverend Law, but I couldn't find a picture of him. So it's just that kind of hit or miss.
Yes, ma'am, right in the front.
Did the U.S. federal government retain the Freedmen's Bureau files?
The question was, did the government have the Freedmen's Bureau files? Yes, they do. And they're actually a really wonderful, rich source for doing genealogy, but also just a rich source of understanding the activities and the role of the Freedmen's Bureau, not only here, but across the country. interesting side note, I'll do a public relations pitch for the African American Museum. They have a project now where they are trying to transcribe the records of the Freedmen's Bureau so people can see them online, and they're looking for volunteers who would like to become, and you can do it online, you don't have to go there, and they'll give you portions of the Freedmen's Bureau records that are handwritten that are sometimes tough to follow, and they want to transcribe and type so people can get access to them. So they exist. They're trying to make them much more available.
Let's take a couple questions from Zoom.
Okay.
Kathy?
Yes, I'll start at the top. We have quite a few. One of the first questions that was asked is it correct to call it Freedman's Bureau or Freedmen's Bureau?
Usually it's Freedmen's. Just, but there. I think you can get both, and I don't know if there's a proper one or the other.
Okay. My next question is, what are there any present day streets or landmarks that define Freedmen's Bureau, the Freedmen's Village? I think somebody weighed in that said they thought it was all contained in the cemetery, but that was a question.
The cemetery has an awful lot of it. I mean, the historical marker I have here is sort of marks that area, but I'm not sure a lot of it is tangible. And I would look to someone else who might know better than I do. It's been a while since I've been over there to look at things. But I think
Okay.
most of it is part of the cemetery.
We had a question from Carol that said, was there an undertaker as part of the village, and where were the people buried? We know that some of them are buried in section 27, but do you know any of the other information beyond that?
I don't know exactly. I think you are right that there are some buried near Arlington Cemetery. But I think the other thing to do is to go to some of the churches that existed and look at the grounds around them, because I think some of them have burial plots around them as well.
All right, thank you. The next question is, you talked about having a robust school. Where did the teachers come from?
Okay. Well, from a variety of places. Some were, for example, Reverend Laws was a teacher. His wife was a teacher there as well. Sojourner Truth was there for a while, but keep in mind that in the years after the Civil War, women, particularly from the North, were coming south, and they were serving as educators for a lot of places. So I would guess that some of the teachers were, some of those individuals were going south, others went further south to teach newly freed individuals.
You just mentioned Sojourner Truth, but is it true that also maybe Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass at one time visited Freedmen's Village?
Oh, I'm sure they visited. I don't think they stayed there, but I'm sure they visited. Yes. I mean, it was such a important place. I think in the eyes of a lot of people, it would be a place they'd want to stop at least and see.
Okay. Joseph wants to know, how were people selected for the village, and was there a waiting list?
Wow, that's a great question. The superintendent and his officials would decide who would be selected, and I don't know what their criteria was. Yes, there was a waiting list, and how you got off the waiting list into the village, I don't know. I haven't been able to read anything that tells me about that.
Okay. Somebody else made just a comment that the houses are very similar. The houses in the pictures are very similar to World War II housing in like Norfolk and Broad Creek Village.
Oh,
I don't know if they were standard government housing.
Yes. Low cost, and I guess easy to do quickly.
So Kathy, let's go back to our live audience.
Okay, because I have about 5 more.
Okay, all right. We're gonna let you do it fast, right?
You're allowed to do your 5.
Oh,
I was just curious if government set up similar communities in other states. Was this the only community of this kind? No, there were contraband camps all throughout the South. Very often where Union troops arrived, people would flock to them. And then have to create these spaces, these camps for people to live in. They weren't all as well organized as Freedman's village, but there were contraband camps all throughout the South under Union troops.
Sir?
Was any of this connected to the Hoffman Boston neighborhood?
The question is this connected to us?
Are they?
Yeah, I don't know. I'm just not sure, could be, but maybe others who are from the area know better than I would.
Hi, I have two questions. One, when they worked on these government farms, what were they producing and who was it sold to? And second, when they were evicted, where were they set? Where did they go?
All right, the first question was, what did they grow? I don't know the specifics. I would guess there would be fruits and vegetables. Wheat seemed to be, I'm not sure if cotton was as important. Virginia cotton was as important. Virginia had been moving towards working with grains and those kind of things. So my guess is they were like truck farms and grains. They'd be sold into the city. And even long past the Civil War, there are residents in Virginia who have farms that did take their stuff into Washington D.C. and some of this. So my guess is that's my part. And to people who buy into each other. The second part of the second question.
Where did the evicted people go?
Where did the evicted people go? I think they were for friends and neighbors they could stay with, or just had to go out and figure out what they were going to do. Some may have gone into Washington D.C. and settled there. Some may have gone out into surrounding areas. There's a pretty vibrant African American community in and around this area, and different enclaves that existed, and some of them may have come from there and gone there as well. I just don't know the specifics.